The air feels heavier tonight, doesn't it? Like something unseen is pressing down, waiting just out of sight. Stories about witches and their curses aren't just folklore, they're warnings. Tonight, I'll take you through 7 chilling tales of curses cast by witches. Each story is darker than the last, and by the end, you might find yourself questioning what you believe, or who might be watching. It began with a single mistake, a mistake that would haunt an entire family for generations. Mia was 9 when it happened. Her family lived in a small, quiet village in Romania, tucked between dense forests and rugged hills. Their days were simple, predictable, even happy, until the fire came. It was late autumn, and the air carried a bitter chill. Mia and her infant brother Luca were playing in the corner of their tiny one-room house while their parents prepared dinner. A sudden scream shattered the calm, followed by frantic shouts and the acrid smell of smoke. The villagers poured into the streets, pointing to the horizon where flames licked the sky. "The forest is on fire!" someone yelled. The blaze reached the village faster than anyone expected. Mia's father scooped her into his arms while her mother cradled Luca. They ran into the chaos, dodging burning debris and collapsing homes. Smoke filled the air, choking their lungs and blinding their eyes. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village, Mia's father turned to her mother. "Where's Luca?" Her mother froze, a look of horror spreading across her face. In the panic, she had dropped the baby's blanket, and Luca was still inside the burning house. The family tried to go back, but the fire was too intense. The house crumbled into ash before their eyes. For hours, they searched the ruins, digging through smoldering wood and rubble. But there was no sign of Luca. No cries, no tiny body, nothing. The villagers whispered their condolences, but their pity carried a bitter undertone. Some believed the fire had been no accident. "The forest spirits are angry," an old woman muttered. "Someone has disturbed the balance." Mia's mother sank into a deep depression, spending her days staring at the charred remains of their home. Her father became withdrawn, leaving the village to work in the city, and Mia was left to carry the guilt. A month later, people began spotting a strange woman near the outskirts of the village. She wore a black dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight and carried a staff carved with symbols no one recognized. "She's a witch," whispered the same old woman who had spoken of forest spirits. "Mark my words, she's here because of what happened." The woman never entered the village, but her presence was unsettling. She stood silently at the edge of the forest, staring at the ruins of Mia's home. One night, Mia's mother heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, the strange woman stood there, her face obscured by a hood. "You forgot him," the woman said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mia's mother screamed and slammed the door, but when her father opened it moments later, there was no one there. Years passed, the village rebuilt, and the fire became a distant memory for most, but not for Mia. By the time she turned 18, the guilt still gnawed at her. She often dreamt of Luca, imagining his tiny face and wondering if he could somehow have survived. On her birthday, Mia woke to find a small box sitting at the foot of her bed. The box was wrapped in tattered cloth and tied with a piece of black string. Inside was a doll, its face scorched and cracked, its body sewn from mismatched scraps of fabric. Mia showed it to her mother, who recoiled in horror. "That's Luca's doll," she whispered. The whispers began that night. They started faint, almost inaudible, a child's voice calling her name. "Mia! Mia!" At first, she thought it was the wind, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house. Her mother begged her to throw the doll away, but Mia couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt a strange connection to it, as if throwing it away would be abandoning Luca all over again. Desperate for answers, Mia visited the oldest villager, a woman named Viorica who was rumored to know about the occult. When Mia showed her the doll, Viorica's eyes widened. "This is a tether," she said. "A witch's curse. The soul of someone lost, bound to an object. Whoever sent this to you wants to remind you of your guilt, and they won't stop until you answer for it." Mia asked if the curse could be broken. Viorica hesitated before giving her an old book filled with rituals. "There is a way," she said, "but it's dangerous." That night, Mia performed the ritual in the ruins of her old home. She lit black candles and chanted the incantation from the book, calling for the spirit to reveal itself. At first, nothing happened, but then the air grew icy and the doll began to move. Its tiny, scorched face turned to her, and a child's voice echoed through the ruins. "You forgot me," it said. "Why did you forget me?" Mia broke down, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I was just a child. I didn't know what to do." The doll's eyes glowed red, and the voice became louder. "Sorry isn't enough. You must pay." Suddenly the candles went out, and darkness consumed her. When the villagers found her the next morning, she was sitting in the ruins, clutching the doll. Her hair had turned white, and her eyes were hollow. She never spoke again. Years later, new families moved into the village, but none stayed for long. They all claimed to hear whispers at night, and some reported seeing a young woman wandering the streets, clutching a burnt doll. The legend of Mia and Luca became a warning for the villagers. Never forget, or the forgotten will come for you. Do you believe guilt can summon something supernatural? Tell me in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales. There are places in the world where the air itself feels wrong. Not the kind of wrong you can see, but the kind you can feel. Thick, heavy, and oppressive. Just outside a quiet New England town, such a place exists. It's marked by an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal fingers. Locals call it the singing tree. The legend goes back centuries to the time of the Salem witch trials. A woman named Eliza Blackwood was accused of witchcraft and hanged from its tallest branch. As the noose tightened around her neck, she sang a haunting melody, promising that her voice would never be silenced. Elliot had heard the stories before, but he didn't believe them. He was a young photographer with a passion for documenting forgotten places, haunted houses, abandoned factories. He thrived on uncovering their hidden beauty. When he heard about the singing tree, he knew it would be perfect for his next project. Elliot arrived at the edge of the forest late in the afternoon. The townspeople had warned him not to go, their faces pale and serious. "You don't want to mess with that tree," an old man had said. "Bad things happen to those who do." Elliot dismissed their warnings as superstitious nonsense. With his camera strapped around his neck and a flashlight in his bag, he set off down the overgrown path. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. As he approached the tree, the light began to fade faster than it should have. The sun, still high in the sky moments earlier, now hung low, casting long, distorted shadows. The tree loomed ahead, its branches twisting unnaturally as if frozen mid-scream. Elliot unpacked his camera and began taking pictures. At first, everything seemed normal. The bark, the roots, the sheer size of the tree. It was all fascinating. But when he reviewed the first photo, his stomach dropped. In the image, a faint outline of a woman stood beneath the tree. Her face was obscured, her head tilted as if she were watching him. Elliot looked up from the camera, his heart racing. There was no one there. He laughed nervously, chalking it up to a trick of the light. But as he continued snapping photos, the outline appeared in every shot. Each time, the figure seemed closer, her form more distinct. As twilight deepened, Elliot heard the first note. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a single hum that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. He froze, his ears straining to catch the sound. The hum grew louder, transforming into a melody. It was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He tried to focus on his work, but the song was impossible to ignore. It seeped into his mind, filling him with an inexplicable sadness. For a moment, he thought he could hear words in the melody, a woman's voice, full of sorrow and anger. On her birthday, Mia woke to find a small box sitting at the foot of her bed. The box was wrapped in tattered cloth and tied with a piece of black string. Inside was a doll, its face scorched and cracked, its body sewn from mismatched scraps of fabric. Mia showed it to her mother, who recoiled in horror. "That's Luca's doll," she whispered. The whispers began that night. They started faint, almost inaudible, a child's voice calling her name. "Mia! Mia!" At first, she thought it was the wind. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house. Her mother begged her to throw the doll away, but Mia couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt a strange connection to it, as if throwing it away would be abandoning Luca all over again. Desperate for answers, Mia visited the oldest villager, a woman named Viorica, who was rumored to know about the occult. When Mia showed her the doll, Viorica's eyes widened. "This is a tether," she said. "A witch's curse. The soul of someone lost, bound to an object. Whoever sent this to you wants to remind you of your guilt, and they won't stop until you answer for it." Mia asked if the curse could be broken. Viorica hesitated before giving her an old book filled with rituals. "There is a way," she said, "but it's dangerous." That night, Mia performed the ritual in the ruins of her old home. She lit black candles and chanted the incantation from the book, calling for the spirit to reveal itself. At first, nothing happened, but then the air grew icy and the doll began to move. Its tiny, scorched face turned to her, and a child's voice echoed through the ruins. "You forgot me," it said. "Why did you forget me?" Mia broke down, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I was just a child. I didn't know what to do." The doll's eyes glowed red, and the voice became louder. "Sorry isn't enough. You must pay." Suddenly the candles went out, and darkness consumed her. When the villagers found her the next morning, she was sitting in the ruins, clutching the doll. Her hair had turned white, and her eyes were hollow. She never spoke again. Years later, new families moved into the village, but none stayed for long. They all claimed to hear whispers at night, and some reported seeing a young woman wandering the streets, clutching a burnt doll. The legend of Mia and Luca became a warning for the villagers. Never forget, or the forgotten will come for you. Do you believe guilt can summon something supernatural? Tell me in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales. Lena had always thought of her family heirloom as a blessing. The silver bracelet, adorned with intricate carvings of vines and runes, had been passed down for generations. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about the bracelet's origins, how it had been forged by a powerful witch centuries ago. "It will protect you," her grandmother said, "but only if you deserve it." Lena had never questioned what that meant. At 28, Lena was a junior designer at a competitive marketing agency. She was ambitious, but often overlooked. She worked late hours, picking up the slack for her co-workers who seemed to succeed effortlessly. The bracelet, always glinting on her wrist, became her silent reassurance. She would succeed eventually. Her grandmother had promised her so. But everything changed after that meeting. It was a Friday morning when Lena was called into a meeting with her boss, Amanda. Her co-worker, Claire, had presented an idea that was nearly identical to a proposal Lena had shared in confidence the week before. Lena's stomach churned as Claire smugly accepted Amanda's praise. After the meeting, Lena confronted Claire in the break room. "You stole my idea," Lena hissed, her voice shaking with anger. Claire smirked. "Relax, Lena. It's not like you were going to do anything with it." That night, Lena sat alone in her tiny apartment, fuming. She glanced down at the bracelet on her wrist. Its silver vines seemed to catch the dim light, shimmering faintly. For a moment, she thought she saw the runes shift, rearranging themselves. She shook her head, chalking it up to exhaustion. The next morning, Claire didn't show up to work. Amanda announced she had slipped down her apartment stairs and broken her leg. Lena felt a strange, creeping satisfaction. Days later, Lena was in a brainstorming session with another co-worker, Mark. He had a habit of interrupting her ideas and passing them off as his own. When he spoke over her for the third time, something inside her snapped. That night, as she replayed the day's frustrations in her mind, she felt a strange warmth on her wrist. Looking down, she saw the bracelet glowing faintly under the moonlight. The vines seemed to move again, shifting and twisting. The next morning, Mark arrived at the office, unable to speak. His voice was completely gone, and no doctor could explain it. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The incidents were too coincidental. She started to suspect the bracelet was more than just an heirloom. Lena decided to visit her grandmother, who was now living in a small care home on the outskirts of the city. When Lena showed her the bracelet, her grandmother's face darkened. "You've been using it, haven't you?" "Using it?" Lena asked, confused. Her grandmother sighed heavily. "The witch who made this bracelet imbued it with her spirit. It protects the wearer by removing threats, but it demands something in return. You must never use it out of anger or spite." Lena protested, insisting she hadn't done anything intentionally, but her grandmother shook her head. "The bracelet doesn't care about intention. It responds to emotion, and once it starts, it won't stop." Lena tried to ignore her grandmother's warning, but things only got worse. A week later, during a team meeting, another co-worker, Ben, jokingly mocked Lena's latest idea. He called it half-baked and suggested she stick to assisting others instead of leading projects. The room laughed, and Lena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. That night, she dreamed of the bracelet. In the dream, the vines unwrapped themselves, crawling up her arm like living tendrils. She woke up sweating, her wrist aching as if something had squeezed it too tightly. The next day, Ben was involved in a freak accident. A car swerved onto the sidewalk, missing everyone but him. Lena felt a growing dread. The bracelet was punishing anyone who wronged her. As weeks turned into months, Lena's paranoia grew. She became hyper-aware of every slight, every insult, every sarcastic comment. The bracelet seemed to hum with energy whenever she was angry or upset. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what might happen if her emotions spiraled out of control. She tried to remove the bracelet, but it wouldn't budge. The clasp was fused shut, and even a jeweler couldn't cut through the metal. At work, her co-workers began avoiding her. They whispered about the strange streak of accidents that seemed to follow her. Lena felt isolated, trapped. The bracelet felt tighter every day, as if it were becoming part of her. Desperate, Lena sought out an antiques dealer known for his expertise in occult artifacts. The moment he saw the bracelet, he recoiled. This isn't protection," he said. "It's possession. The witch bound her soul to this object. It acts as her agent, punishing anyone who threatens its wearer." Lena begged him to help her remove it, but the dealer shook his head. "The only way to break the curse is to destroy the bracelet, but that will come at a cost. The witch will demand a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "Your freedom," the dealer said grimly. That night, Lena decided she couldn't live like this anymore. She took the bracelet and returned to her grandmother's old home, which had been abandoned for years. In the attic, she found her grandmother's collection of books on witchcraft and curses. She performed the ritual outlined in the books, lighting black candles and drawing symbols on the floor. As she chanted the incantation, the room grew cold and the bracelet burned against her skin. The witch appeared before her, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and a voice like shattered glass. "You dare defy me?" the witch hissed. "I didn't ask for this," Lena screamed. "Take it back! Take it all back!" The witch laughed. "You've enjoyed my gifts. Now you must pay the price." The vines of the bracelet unraveled, crawling up Lena's arm and wrapping around her neck. She gasped for breath as the witch's voice filled her mind. "Your soul is mine." When Lena's co-workers reported her missing, the police found her apartment empty. The only trace of her was the bracelet, sitting on her desk, its silver vines glinting in the light. Weeks later, a new employee found the bracelet in the office and decided to try it on. She thought it was beautiful, and the cycle began again. What would you have done in Lena's place? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more chilling stories like this. In the small town of Coldwater, there were only two certainties. Everyone knew each other's secrets, and everyone ended up in the cemetery. The town's gravedigger, Eli Marks, had spent over 20 years burying Coldwater's dead. He worked quietly and kept to himself, knowing the graveyard was the one place where secrets stayed buried. But one stormy night, Eli made a decision that would unearth something far darker than the secrets of the living. It was an unusually cold evening in late autumn, and the rain had been falling for hours. Eli sat in his small, cluttered shed at the edge of the cemetery, nursing a cup of coffee and listening to the distant rumble of thunder. He was just about to call it a night when a knock came at the door. Standing outside was a cloaked woman, her face hidden by the shadows of her hood. She held a small black box in her hands, its surface glistening with rainwater. "I need you to bury this," she said, her voice low and calm. Eli frowned. "Ma'am, we don't bury anything without the proper paperwork. You'll have to—" She interrupted him. "No questions. I'll pay you handsomely for your trouble." Eli hesitated. He didn't recognize the woman, and something about her felt off. But when she produced a bundle of crisp bills from her cloak, his hesitation melted away. Money like that could go a long way toward fixing his leaky roof and paying off his mounting debts. "Fine," he said, taking the box, "but it'll have to wait till morning." The woman's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her touch was ice cold. "No," she said firmly. "It must be buried tonight, and it must be buried deep." Eli waited until the woman disappeared into the rain before grabbing his shovel and heading into the cemetery. The box was small and oddly heavy, its surface etched with strange symbols that made him uneasy. The storm made the task miserable. Mud clung to his boots, and the rain made it hard to see. He finally found a spot near the edge of the cemetery where the older graves lay forgotten and overgrown. As he dug, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a whisper, almost like someone calling his name. He froze, his heart pounding, but when he looked around, the cemetery was empty. He shook it off and finished the job, burying the box as deep as he could manage. By the time he packed the dirt back into place, the whispers had stopped. When he returned to his shed, he found another bundle of cash on his desk, neatly stacked. The woman was gone. The next morning, Eli woke up feeling uneasy. He couldn't stop thinking about the box and the woman's cryptic words. But as the day wore on, he convinced himself it was just another odd job, one of many he'd taken over the years. That night, as he patrolled the cemetery, he heard it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Eli." He followed the sound to the spot where he'd buried the box. The soil looked freshly disturbed, as if someone or something had dug it up. Panic set in as he dropped to his knees, frantically digging with his bare hands. But when he reached the bottom, the box was still there, untouched. "Just my imagination," he muttered, filling the hole back in. But as he walked away, he could feel eyes watching him. The whispers grew louder over the next few days, following Eli wherever he went. They seemed to echo from the graves themselves, growing stronger at night. On the fourth night, he found muddy footprints leading from the grave where he'd buried the box to the door of his shed. Inside, the black box sat on his desk, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly in the dark. Terrified, Eli grabbed the box and ran back to the cemetery, determined to bury it even deeper. But as he dug, the ground began to shake. The graveyard came alive with a chorus of voices, screaming and wailing. The box slipped from his hands and landed with a dull thud in the open grave. From the shadows, the cloaked woman appeared, her face still obscured. "You shouldn't have taken my offer," she said. "Now, you owe a debt." The woman revealed herself, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes like empty voids. She told Eli the truth about the box. It contained the soul of a powerful witch, bound by a curse to remain buried. By accepting her money and disturbing the grave, Eli had taken responsibility for keeping the curse contained. "Fail," she said, "and the dead will rise." Eli tried to refuse, but the woman vanished into the shadows, leaving him alone with the box. Over the next week, strange things began happening in Coldwater. Graves in the cemetery appeared freshly dug, their occupants missing. People reported seeing shadowy figures wandering the streets at night. Eli was tormented by nightmares of skeletal hands clawing their way out of the earth, dragging him down into darkness. Each morning, he woke to find the box back in his shed, no matter where he had buried it the night before. One night, the voices returned, louder than ever. This time, they weren't just whispers, they were screams. The ground in the cemetery cracked and split open, and from the darkness emerged the dead. Eli ran, but no matter where he went, the dead followed. Desperate, Eli sought help from the town's oldest resident, a recluse named Agnes, who was rumored to dabble in witchcraft. When he showed her the box, her face turned pale. "This is no ordinary curse," she said. "The witch bound her soul to the box to keep her enemies from rising. You've disturbed the balance." Agnes told him there was only one way to break the curse. He had to return the box to its original resting place and sacrifice something of great value: his own life. Eli returned to the cemetery, the box in his hands. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground writhed as the dead clawed their way to the surface. He placed the box in the grave and knelt before it, whispering an apology. As he prepared to offer his life, the cloaked woman appeared once more. "Do you understand now?" she asked. Eli nodded, tears streaming down his face. He placed his hand on the box, and the ground swallowed him whole. The next morning, the cemetery was quiet. The graves were undisturbed, and the whispers were gone. The townspeople never found Eli's body, but they often heard faint whispers when passing the cemetery at night, whispers that sounded like his voice. The gravedigger had paid his debt, but the black box remains, waiting for the next fool to take the offer. Would you take the stranger's offer if you were in Eli's shoes? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment for more chilling tales. In the quiet town of Black Hollow, the history books tell a story most have forgotten. 300 years ago, during the height of the witch trials, a woman named Sybil Halloway was accused of witchcraft. The town's elders claimed she had cursed their crops, poisoned their wells, and consorted with the devil. They hanged her in the town square and left her body to rot as a warning. But before she died, Sybil swore an oath. "Black Hollow will pay for its sins. My curse will live on, and so will I." For years after her death, strange things happened in Black Hollow. Livestock dying overnight, people disappearing, and storms that left the town in ruin. Eventually, the stories faded into legend. But in the modern day, some still believed Sybil's curse was real. Lila Carter had just moved to Black Hollow, inheriting her late grandmother's house at the edge of the forest. The house was old and creaky, with wallpaper peeling from the walls and a faint smell of damp wood. But it was hers, and she was determined to make it home. As she cleaned out the attic, she found an old chest tucked beneath a dusty sheet. Inside were yellowed papers, an iron key, and a weathered diary with Sybil Halloway's name scrawled on the cover. Lila didn't believe in curses or witches, but the diary intrigued her. Its pages were filled with cryptic writings, symbols, and what appeared to be incantations. One entry caught her attention. "My curse binds this town, and within this house lies the key to breaking it or unleashing it forever." That night, Lila dreamed of a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted smile standing at the foot of her bed. The next morning, Lila searched the house for any sign of what Sybil might have meant. Her exploration led her to the cellar door, which had been nailed shut for years. The iron key from the chest fit perfectly into the lock. Inside, she found a small, dark room filled with shelves of dusty jars, each containing strange, preserved objects: bones, dried herbs, and small animal skulls. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it sat a blackened, rusted cauldron. As Lila approached, the air grew colder. The cauldron seemed to hum, a low vibration that rattled her teeth. On the floor near the cauldron was a warning carved into the stone: "Disturb this place, and you will awaken her." Lila backed away, slamming the cellar door shut. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Lila would wake up to find her furniture rearranged, her belongings missing, or her windows open despite locking them. At night, she heard whispers in the walls. Sybil's name, repeated over and over. The townspeople were no help. When she mentioned her experiences, they grew uneasy and warned her to leave the house. "That place is cursed," one old man said. "Nothing good ever comes from poking around in the past." But Lila was stubborn. Determined to understand what was happening, she returned to the diary. One entry seemed to describe a ritual, a way to break the curse for good. It required lighting a fire in the cauldron and burning 3 specific items: something of Sybil's, something of the town's, and something of the person performing the ritual. Lila gathered the necessary items: Sybil's diary, a small token from the town square, and a strand of her own hair. That night, she descended into the cellar, lit the cauldron, and began the ritual. As she chanted the words from the diary, the room grew unbearably cold. The fire in the cauldron burned black, and the whispers became screams. Sybil appeared in the flames, her face twisted in rage. "You cannot undo what was done," she bellowed. The flames erupted, forcing Lila to flee the cellar. The next morning, she found scorch marks on her walls and floors, and her reflection in the mirror didn't look quite like her. It smiled when she didn't. Terrified, Lila visited the town historian, an elderly woman named Edith, who lived in a cluttered house filled with books and artifacts. Edith listened intently as Lila explained what she'd found and what she'd done. "Sybil's curse isn't just about revenge," Edith said. "It's tied to the blood of this town. The elders who killed her weren't innocent. They were the ones practicing dark magic, and they framed her to protect themselves." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "So, how do I stop her?" Edith hesitated. "The curse can only be broken by confronting her directly and offering a greater sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Lila asked. Edith didn't answer. Lila prepared for the confrontation, gathering items she thought might protect her: salt, iron, and a mirror. That night, she returned to the cellar and lit the cauldron once more. Sybil appeared again, her form more solid this time. Her hollow eyes bore into Lila's as she spoke. "You cannot stop what has already begun. Black Hollow will suffer as I suffered." Lila stood her ground, holding up the mirror. "You don't scare me." Sybil laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Then you're a fool." The room shook violently, and shadowy figures began emerging from the walls, spirits bound by Sybil's curse. They clawed at Lila, pulling her toward the cauldron. In desperation, Lila threw the diary into the flames, along with the iron key. The spirit screamed, and Sybil's form flickered. But the cauldron burned brighter, and Sybil's voice grew louder. "It's not enough! You must give more!" Realizing what Edith meant, Lila took a deep breath and reached into the flames. The pain was unbearable, but she kept going until she felt the cold iron at the bottom of the cauldron. She pulled out a small, blackened amulet, the true source of Sybil's power. With all her strength, she smashed the amulet on the stone floor. The spirits vanished, and the cauldron's fire went out. The cellar was silent once more. Lila collapsed, her hands burned and trembling. When she emerged from the house, dawn was breaking. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, Black Hollow began to change. The unease that had plagued the town for centuries was gone, and the townspeople felt at peace for the first time in generations. As for Lila, she left the house and never looked back. But she often wondered if the curse was truly broken, or if Sybil was simply waiting for the next unwitting soul to disturb her rest. What would you have done in Lila's place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more spine-chilling tales. In a quiet town nestled near an ancient forest, whispers of a curse lingered among the residents. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of a witch who had been cast out centuries ago, her wrath so great that she bound herself to the forest, ensuring anyone who entered would face her vengeance. No one dared venture too far into the trees, but for one man, the curse would become impossible to ignore. Ethan Marsh was an experienced hunter, known for his skill and precision. The forest provided him and his family with food and a modest income from selling game. Though many warned him to steer clear of the deeper woods, Ethan dismissed the stories as folklore. One late autumn morning, Ethan set out to track a deer that had been seen near the forest's edge. The hunt took longer than expected, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself deeper in the woods than ever before. The air was colder there, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, were absent. Finally, he spotted the deer, standing still as if waiting for him. Ethan raised his rifle, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Just as he pulled the trigger, a sharp, blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. The deer bolted, and Ethan's shot missed its mark. He froze, his heart pounding. The scream didn't sound human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something else, something ancient and filled with rage. When Ethan returned home, shaken but unharmed, he noticed something strange. On the back of his hand was a faint black mark, a swirling pattern that seemed to pulse under his skin. At first he thought it was dirt or a bruise, but no amount of scrubbing could remove it. That night he dreamed of a woman cloaked in shadows, her eyes burning with fury. She spoke no words, but her outstretched hand pointed directly at him. The next morning, Ethan's wife, Sarah, noticed the mark. "What's that?" she asked, concern in her voice. "Nothing," he said, brushing her off. But deep down, he knew it was something. Over the following days, Ethan's life began to unravel. His traps in the forest were always empty, as if the animals had vanished. When he hunted, his aim faltered, and every shot missed. Then came the noises. At first, they were faint whispers at the edge of his hearing. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until he could make out the words, thief, trespasser, cursed. The mark on his hand darkened, spreading up his arm like black veins. One night, as he sat alone in his workshop sharpening his knife, the shadows in the room seemed to move. From the corner of his eye, he saw something, a figure, cloaked and formless, watching him. When he turned to confront it, the figure was gone. Desperate for answers, Ethan sought out Agnes Miller, the town's recluse. Known for her knowledge of the old ways, Agnes was rumored to be a descendant of the witches who once lived in the forest. When she saw the mark on Ethan's hand, her expression turned grave. "You've been touched by the Shadow Witch," she said. "The stories are true. She cursed the forest to protect it from intruders. You've taken something that belongs to her." "I didn't take anything," Ethan protested. Agnes shook her head. "The deer you hunted. It wasn't an ordinary animal. It was part of her domain. You may not have killed it, but you tried, and now she's claimed you." "What can I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Agnes handed him a bundle of herbs and a small weathered book. "There's a ritual, a way to appease her, but it's dangerous. The witch feeds on fear and pain. If your heart isn't pure, the ritual could destroy you." That night, under a pale full moon, Ethan ventured back into the forest. The book described a specific clearing where the ritual could be performed, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. The whispers returned as he walked, louder and more menacing. The shadows between the trees seemed to reach for him, their shapes twisting into ghastly forms. Finally, he found the clearing. At its center stood a circle of stones, covered in moss and faintly glowing. Ethan lit the herbs and began reciting the incantation from the book. The forest grew silent. The air around him felt thick, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then she appeared. The Shadow Witch emerged from the darkness, her form shifting and writhing like smoke. Her eyes burned like coals, and her voice was a low, guttural growl. "You dare disturb my domain?" she hissed. "I didn't mean to," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I just want to make it right." The witch extended her hand, and the shadows around Ethan began to move. They formed into figures, people he recognized: his wife Sarah, his young son Peter. The figures screamed in agony, their voices filled with despair. "If you wish to free yourself, you must make a choice," the witch said. "Sacrifice yourself or sacrifice them." Ethan fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please, don't hurt them. They've done nothing wrong." The witch's laughter echoed through the clearing. "The forest does not forgive. Choose." Ethan closed his eyes, his heart breaking. "Take me," he whispered. "Let them go." The witch raised her hand, and the shadows engulfed him. Pain seared through his body as the mark on his arm burned brighter, spreading until it covered him entirely. For a moment, everything went silent. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was alone in the clearing. The mark on his arm was gone, and the forest was still. He stumbled back home, weak but alive. The next morning, Ethan found Sarah and Peter safe, as if nothing had happened. But the forest was no longer the same. Its once vibrant trees were withered, its paths overgrown. Ethan never hunted again. Though he had survived, he knew he would never truly escape the Shadow Witch's curse. Every so often, on quiet nights, he would see her figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching him, waiting. Would you have made the same choice as Ethan? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more chilling stories. In a forgotten corner of an antique shop on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, a mirror stood collecting dust. Its ornate frame was carved with intricate symbols, and its glass, though tarnished with age, seemed unnervingly pristine at its center. The shopkeeper had long considered getting rid of it, but every time he tried, something stopped him. A shadow at the edge of his vision, a strange voice calling his name. He sold it to Evelyn Pierce for $50 on a rainy afternoon. She was delighted with her find, unaware of the mirror's dark history. The mirror had once belonged to a woman named Callista Moore, a reclusive artist who lived in the late 1800s. Known for her beauty and strange paintings, Callista was rumored to dabble in witchcraft. After her husband left her for another woman, Callista's heartbreak turned to obsession. She poured her anguish into the mirror, performing rituals and binding her soul to it. When she died under mysterious circumstances, the mirror passed from owner to owner, each one meeting an untimely and violent end. Evelyn, a 34-year-old art teacher with an eye for unique pieces, had no idea she'd brought such an object into her home. Evelyn placed the mirror in her bedroom, thrilled with how its vintage charm transformed the space. That night, she noticed something odd. As she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, the reflection didn't quite match her movements. She chalked it up to poor lighting, but over the next few days, the feeling persisted. Sometimes her reflection seemed slower, lagging behind her actions by just a fraction of a second. Other times, she thought she saw a flicker of movement behind her, something shadowy that vanished the moment she turned around. One evening, Evelyn came home from work feeling drained. She sat in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Evelyn." Her blood ran cold. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Shaking it off as her imagination, she resolved to get more sleep. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, as she sat before the mirror, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It called her name, beckoning her to listen. A week later, Evelyn's best friend Claire came to visit. Evelyn shared her unease about the mirror, laughing nervously as she recounted the strange occurrences. "You're overthinking it," Claire said, examining the glass. "It's just a mirror." But as she stood before it, Claire froze. Her reflection lingered in the glass for just a moment too long after she turned away. Claire shivered. "Okay, that's creepy. Maybe it's just old glass or something." That night, Evelyn dreamed of a woman standing in her bedroom. The woman's face was pale and angular, her eyes dark pits of shadow. She reached out to Evelyn, her hand pressing against the glass of the mirror. Evelyn woke up screaming. Determined to understand what was happening, Evelyn began researching the mirror. Her search led her to an obscure blog that chronicled the mirror's history. The more she read, the more horrified she became. The blog detailed stories of people who had owned the mirror, an actress who vanished without a trace, a writer who was found dead with her reflection painted onto every surface of her home, a wealthy businessman who went mad, claiming the mirror wanted his soul. The entries all mentioned one name, Callista Moore. Evelyn tried to rid herself of the mirror. She dragged it out to the curb, but the next morning it was back in her bedroom, its surface polished to a perfect shine. She threw a blanket over it, hoping to block out whatever was inside. But the whispers seeped through, growing louder and more menacing. The voice no longer just called her name. It began mocking her, taunting her failures and insecurities. "You're alone," it hissed. "Just like me." Evelyn started to see Callista's face everywhere, on reflective surfaces, in her peripheral vision, even in her dreams. She stopped sleeping, her nights filled with the witch's haunting presence. One night, exhausted and desperate, Evelyn stood before the mirror and shouted, "What do you want from me?" The glass rippled like water, and Callista's form materialized. Her voice was soft but filled with malice. "I want what I lost," Callista said. "My beauty, my life, my soul." Evelyn felt her knees weaken. "I can't give you that." Callista's smile twisted. "Then you will take my place." The blog had mentioned one way to escape the mirror's curse, a ritual that would sever Callista's hold on the physical world. But it required a dangerous sacrifice. Evelyn would have to destroy the mirror, knowing the witch would fight to preserve her prison. Evelyn gathered the materials, black candles, salt, and a hammer. That night, she drew a circle of salt around the mirror, lit the candles, and began the incantation from the blog. The room grew icy, and the shadows in the mirror writhed. Callista's voice filled the air, screaming in fury. "You cannot break me!" she roared. The glass began to crack, but the force of Callista's power threw Evelyn across the room. As the mirror shattered further, Callista emerged, her form no longer confined. She loomed over Evelyn, her shadowy presence filling the room. "You think you can escape?" she snarled. "I will consume you." Evelyn grabbed the hammer and swung with all her strength, shattering the mirror completely. Callista let out a deafening scream as her form dissolved into a cloud of ash. For a moment, Everything was still. Evelyn woke up on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. The mirror was gone, its ornate frame empty. The whispers had ceased, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt silent. She threw the remains of the mirror into the river, watching as the pieces sank beneath the water. But even now, Evelyn can't look into a mirror without seeing Callista's face, just for a fleeting second. Which of these cursed tales will haunt you tonight? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more terrifying stories like these.